You know what a good fantasy series needs? A crucifixion scene, and luckily Ted Williams agrees. Cheers. Welcome back everybody to me talking about Memory, Sorrow and Thorn, the first trilogy in 4 books by Ted Williams that is set in his world of Osten Ard. And today we'll be talking about the final book, To Green Angel Tower Part 2. I'll try to remember to put everything in a playlist down below so you can actually watch the previous videos if you're interested. This will be mostly spoilers because, you know, why do you need a synopsis for the 4th book, or in this case the 2nd part of the 3rd book of a trilogy. But I'll give you a quick one and then we'll talk about themes and final thoughts on that first series that, you know, ended something like 30 years ago. Before we move on to talk about the quick novel, The Heart of What Was Lost, which kind of connects it to the next series, which is of course called The Last King of Osten Ard. And we'll find out how that one goes in the near-ish future. But that's enough for now. Let's actually look at like what you get and then what I think about it. Alright, quick synopsis. This one ends the entire series. We have had, you know, the preparations after everyone defeated people at the Stone of Farewell, and we've come to the, well, final confrontation between Prince Joshua and his brother King Elias. People are trying to, you know, reconquer the lands and confront him around the Hayhold, or, well, Aswa as the Sithi call it, for one final time, whereas at the same time the Storm King is obviously trying to do whatever the Storm King is going to do. The comet is back that was, you know, hinted at in previous books, and, yeah. Everything comes to a final showdown around Green Angel Tower, which is, of course, the largest tower on that castle, which was built by the city, well, the tower, and there's a green angel on top of it. Why? We don't know, because no one ever mentioned angels outside of this one specific case. So, does Osiris' Adenite church have angels like our church? We don't know. We never find out, at least not this time around. Anyway, that's what you get. You get mostly the final showdown. Some people die, some people live, the world gets saved, sort of, maybe. You know, what you expect from the final installment of an epic fantasy series. And that's all I can say. If you've made it this far, yeah, finish the book, for fuck's sake. It's a good one. Anyway, let's talk about themes and spoilers and stuff. Alright, so, as I already mentioned in my previous video, this is very much the point where the pace or speed of the series has slowed to a creeping halt because, well, you know, there's suddenly all these plot threads that need to be talked about, because we've added all kinds of perspectives and so forth. And this doesn't end here. In fact, it kind of becomes even more problematic because, you know, this is the final book, so you've got to tie up all those loose ends, take all these different plot threads and kind of snip them up, put some knots in them, make it all fit. And this, I think, is something that a lot of epic fantasy struggles with. The idea that all plots need to be resolved, all stories need to come to an end at the end, because, you know, that's kind of how this works. Which is interesting because, say, for example, The Lord of the Rings doesn't fully end like that, which makes a lot of sense, because it's set in an ongoing history of Middle-earth. There are notes of what happens after Lord of the Rings. We even hear about, you know, the death of Aragorn and folks like that. There's an ongoing history. It's the same with, say, the Malazan Book of the Fallen, which, spoiler, does not actually resolve all plot threads because it's just one part of an ongoing history of a world. And for some reason, people writing epic fantasy after Tolkien did not figure that one out for a long time. Stuff like The Wheel of Time does have a more or less fully resolved ending, which also means, you know, maybe one of the reasons why that final book that Brandon Sanderson had to finish for Robert Jordan didn't, in fact, take 3 books. And something similar happens here, where, you know, the final book needed 2 volumes. So, once again, the idea that all story threads need to be resolved is something of a problem that I believe comes not so much from like the epic tradition, but from other book traditions and literary traditions that are kind of folded into this. I mean, even with Troy, Troy falls at the end of the Iliad, and we don't know what happens to everyone else. We kind of find out afterwards in the sequel, and not even there everyone is accounted for. So that idea, or that compulsion to end, to resolve all possible threads in every character's life, comes from somewhere else. Possibly it's the fairy tale idea of they lived happily ever after. Possibly it's shorter novels that focus on a very small cast of characters where it's easy to do that. I'm not sure, fully aware of it, but it's certainly something that does, in fact, show up here with all kinds of problems. And some of them are good, some of them are not so good. But let's look at what happens first and how the structure works. Because Ted Williams does something clever-ish here, which is, at least for our main character Simon and our possibly second main character Miriamel, we get something of a callback to the beginning of the book. The idea that things kind of come sort of full circle-ish, which means that, they're traveling back to the Hayhold together, just them and nobody else. So you have that whole, walking through the forest on their own thing that happened and took up quite some time in the Dragonbone Chair. You have sort of like an echo of that, which allows, Ted Williams to show how both of them have grown or changed over the time of like 2 years or whatever, however long this is supposed to take. I somehow feel that the times don't fully add up in this book. Never mind, it's not that important, but the idea is a good one to sort of have that callback, how the heroes have changed, how our characters have changed over time, and maybe what they have lost on the way, and how things are not as innocent or whatever as they were in, say, the Dragonbone Chair, because now, Simon's really horny for Miriamel, and she is still struggling with the fact that she's no longer a virgin, and we've talked about how ridiculous that is, but it's sort of the conflict that they have there, and as I said, it kind of works well until they reach the Hayhold. You may also see the idea of coming back to a ruined home, sort of as Tad Williams' attempt of taking, the scourging of the Shire from Lord of the Rings, but putting it before the actual end. The idea of coming back home and realizing that home has changed or home has been destroyed while you were out there doing your adventuring. Now, I think it works better the other way around, but we'll come to that later in this conversation. So that's one large part. The other part is, of course, Joshua and Camaris, the legendary knight who finally recovered his knowledge and stuff, and his legendary sword, moving to Naban to take over that province, and so building up enough force so they can actually attack the Hayhold, while Eolair and the few Hernastiri and, of course, Jiriki and the Sidi are still outside the gates of Naglimund, which is held by the Norns. Now, there's something happening here that I think I need to point out, which is, I've said it before, I don't think Ted Williams is particularly good at creating, at finishing up stories. I've had a much bigger issue with Otherland. For now, I don't plan to reread it and talk about it, but it's certainly in here as well. Which means there's, once it comes to the actual final plot of the villains, Ted Williams waits far too long before sort of revealing it. Yes, there are some very few hints here and there about the idea that there are maybe false messengers, but when the final reveal comes, it does feel very much like he's pulling it out of, somewhere, which may be a divine machine or just his posterior. It just feels weird. Part of that is, of course, the idea of the 5 houses. Yes, we've heard that, he has, the Storm King has his 5 servants, which he calls the Red Hand. And while they may be sort of like ring wraiths, they are probably also something else. And what we learn very late in this novel, let's be clear, very, very late in this novel, we learn that they are, in fact, creating 5 houses, which they need to sort of build this. So they need to do these, create 5 magical places to anchor that final ritual that will bring the Storm King back into our world. We'll come back to his motivations later, but the point is, the whole idea of those houses is also left until the end of this book, and it would have been far easier to talk about that earlier. Maybe I've missed something there, but when the Norns attack Naglimund in the beginning, well, halfway through Dragonbone Chair, it would have been very easy to hint something, or drop something fifth, it's a fourth house there, fourth house, something, and we don't get any of that sort. We have nothing of that until, well, the second half of the fourth book, basically, and that's just a bit late from a construction point. It feels like Tad Williams was like, oh gods, I need to come up with something here. And so he just crams all of that into the final book. And he does a very similar thing, only even more egregious with Otherland, just as a point here. Anyway, so that's sort of what we see, that the final plans are, of course, the Storm King comes back to life. He obviously takes over Elias' body, and, something happens. That part of him, taking over Elias' body is sort of hinted at from the beginning, but the reasons, are left to you, the reader, and the way is obviously, left until this final book, when we hear that they're building the third house on a just random mountaintop where, some of those fire dancers try to sacrifice Simon and Miriamel. And that once again, I think, is an issue here, because the fire dancers, yes, they show up in Stone of Farewell, and they are mentioned into Green Angel Tower Part 1. The problem, however, is that the fire dancers don't fully make sense. So they're cultists believing in the Storm King, sort of. And I think this is, once again, part of the issue that kind of plagues or just marks the entirety of this book, or these books, which is taking that very ethereal series of stories, the epic tale of Lord of the Rings, or Middle Earth in general, and making it a very earthly story. So you need people, humans, supporting the Dark Lord. Tolkien solves that by never giving us those people. He obviously makes them all non-white, so we can get our racism in, but we never hear the motivations for any of the the dark Númenóreans, the people from Harad. We don't get their motivations for why they joined them, seduced or possibly enslaved by the Dark Lord. We don't see that with Tad Williams. We also don't see it with the Dark Friends, for example, in Wheel of Time, which I think sort of serve a similar, up to a point, a similar purpose, which means you need to have traitors on your own side. We don't have those in Lord of the Rings, because the idea of traitors in your own side, people getting seduced by the Dark Lord, is something that doesn't work for Tolkien's very specific metaphysics. It's also very much a theme that only comes up much stronger in, say, the 1950s and 60s, and probably mostly during the Cold War in America, when you hunt for, your commie traitors on your side. And I think, I'm not saying this is a political novel in that regard, or explicitly a political novel, but the idea of mistrusting your fellow humans, your fellow citizens, in a way, is something that has had a huge impact on parts of the West, or parts of the East, throughout the Cold War, in a way that it didn't necessarily have, didn't have in, say, the 1930s, when Tolkien started writing Lord of the Rings. So that, I think, sort of explains why we have the fire dances. I feel that execution is not yet that well done, which may just be a time of, trying to figure out how to integrate those very different bits and pieces into one coherent whole. See, Stephen R. Donaldson kind of ignores that, or kind of avoids that problem, by making it all very, upping, the symbolism, and making it all basically about the inner self. So he kind of avoids having to deal with these real-world problems. His text is, if anything, even more stylized in a lot of ways. At least the first trilogy is more stylized even than the Lord of the Rings trilogy, for example. So that's something that comes again through here. And I think it also extends to the actual end of the story. See, what happens, and I think this is important, is once we reach the end and the motivations of our bad guys. Let's just like recapitulate who our bad guys are. There is, of course, Inaluki, the Storm King, and his the Red Hand, who are Sithi that died in the defense of Aswa when the humans took over that place. He wants to do something, and we'll go back to what he wants in a minute because I think it's important. He basically wants to undo 500 years of human rule on Osten Ard and turn back time. That's what he wants. That's, understandable. There's revenge in there, all of these things. Then there is King Elias, who originally wants to just talk to his dead wife and get his wife back. The idea, obviously, of someone losing someone and doing dark things to get them back is well established, and it's a motivation that kind of makes sense. In that regard, he obviously trusts Priorities, the priest, and this is kind of where the whole thing sort of breaks down, because Priorities' motivation is just he wants power because he's evil. Does he have a reason why he wants power? Something where he believes that knowledge does something? No, he just wants to rule the world. So we kind of see that problem where Tolkien, for example, goes with like a more elemental or fundamental evil, where he goes like, well, Sauron just wants to rule the world. But Sauron is this like sort of immaterial creature at the point where, at least at the point when, Lord of the Rings starts. Priorities is still a man and behaves in that sort of cartoonish villain way, while his motivation is no more than, the fundamental wish to rule the entire universe, just like Sauron or Melkor for that matter. And I think that's I think sort of where this whole breaks down, where later fantasy novels, say Game of Thrones, A Song of Ice and Fire, even some of the grimdark stuff kind of move further because they refrain from having that fundamental evil, pure evil wish to just rule the world as the motivation. They finish that step towards human motivations and make all the human motivations human, which makes it easier to sort of bring up some compassion for these people. You don't need to have compassion for Priorities. You can have compassion both for Inaluki, the Storm King, and for Elias. They're understandable. Priorities is still not understandable. He just wants to rule the world. In the same way that, not even Sauron or Melkor are understandable beyond the way you can possibly understand Lucifer in Paradise Lost as well, which is what they are modeled on. So I feel, once again, we see how Memory of Sorrow Thorn is an important step on the way from the epic, mythic level or way of telling a fantasy story that Tolkien introduced towards what we see nowadays with a more modern, more humanized, or at least more human-centric and earthly or worldly approach to fantasy. But it's still sort of caught in the middle, not fully Ted Williams does not fully commit to making it all very human and understandable. He kind of clings to some of these the vestiges of that mythic, of that mythic metaphysical approach that we see with Tolkien. And I think that's one of the points where we kind of see that breaking down is with these motivations at the end of the day. He also does, of course, go back to adding some interesting symbolisms here. We have, as I hinted, Simon being, tied to a wheel and turned around, and around, which does very much mimic a bit of a crucifixion, of course. However, let's wrap this all up. So, at the end of the day, Priorities does overreach because he wants to rule the world. He tries to actually also control the Storm King. The Storm King in Elias' body destroys Priorities. Then Simon gives Elias some compassion. Elias regains some strength over the Storm King. And Miriamel shoots him dead. And then everything just collapses and we have a happy ending afterwards because now it's time to rebuild. And I think there's a few aspects here that I want to highlight before we move on to the final or general thoughts on the entire series. One part here is the bit with the swords. Now, once again, I feel they are sort of a leftover of trying to, pay homage to Lord of the Rings, right? Where we have the Ring of Power, which some people think or call, a metaphor for nuclear weapons. I'm not fully convinced that Tolkien meant exactly that. There's that warning for allegories, and yes, it's a very powerful thing, and it's very seductive and so forth. I get it. However, with the swords, that metaphor is made much clearer, which is generally a thing that we see with that step towards a more worldly way of epic fantasy, making things more explicit, which Ted Williams does continuously, which is, why we have Simon do the whole compassion thing in his head, so we explicitly read that he feels compassion for Elias and even the Storm King and so forth. We get all of that explicitly spelled out. We don't have to do the work here, which, once again, it's also made very clear that those the swords are sort of an analog. They're weapons. They're, meant to kill and destroy. They're also sort of ripping a hole into reality and binding things that are not meant to be bound. And then you obviously take these three swords together, and then their energy together will actually unravel time. And does that sound like a critical mass? Possibly. Right? So the metaphor is much stronger. But once again, it doesn't fully work because this is written in the 1980s after, say, the end of the Cold War, or near the end of the Cold War. But the idea of nuclear fear kind of comes out of nowhere here, right? No one ever throughout the story thinks like, well, if we have all the three swords together, it may actually destroy the universe. That fear is only present in the final pages of the final book, which does take away from that. Whereas, say, with Lord of the Rings, everyone knows that the ring is incredibly powerful, and whoever has that thing has the power to destroy the world and unmake everything if they want to. So that fear of the weapons is not there. Everyone is just like, we want to get those weapons. And I think that does, once again, flatten the power of these possible metaphors or things we can take from the book a bit. It's, once again, it's there. I see where it's coming from. I just feel that in the urge or need to make it understandable, to make it very clear, it kind of leaves, ambiguity behind, and ambiguity is something that makes literature often more powerful. But this, once again, may just be part of the, impact of a more American pulp side of fantasy, because, if you read your Robert E. Howard, he's not one for ambiguity either. And I think that may just be part of it. So, where does this all leave us? And this is, I think, where I want to, have a general look at the entire series and end it all. Memory, Sorrow, Thorn is a very American series. It's an American answer, I would say, to Lord of the Rings, which is a very, very British fantasy series. And there's some elements where I kind of want to point that out, and I think the ending and so forth make that very clear. One thing here is that, of course, the overall story is sort of American. You have this country, and the elves are there, well, the city are there, the trolls are there, which are very much patterned after Native Americans of a more northerly persuasion. The city are, partly, patterned after East Asian cultures. They're obviously also still, they hang out in the forests and do all the sort of like native things that native cultures are supposed to do in that form of idea. And then the humans come and fuck everything up and take over the land. Now that's very much a concern of American history. And I think it's important to understand that. Like, I'm not saying this is an explicitly a political book, but the story of taking away a country from its native inhabitants, possibly genociding a large swath of them, is part of the American identity. Yes, it has been celebrated for a long time in stuff like the Westerns all the way to the 1950s or 60s and 70s. Later Westerns are obviously deconstructing that. It's an ongoing part of American understanding, whether you think it's, your God-given right to take over the country, someone like John Wayne would think, or whether you think it was a huge crime. It is part of that story, whereas the British story, when Tolkien wrote the book, at the end of the 40s and, the beginning of the 50s, is the story of slowly losing an empire. Middle-earth does not have these elements in there. There is no invaders in Middle-earth. Elves and humans are living there. It's just that like one culture is slowly retreating, and while the elves are retreating, the age of elves and wizards ends, and the dawn of the age of man is there at the end of Lord of the Rings. That's not because humans just forcefully actually kill all the elves and drive them out of the land. That's not what happens there. Whereas with Osten Ard, that's very much what happened there. The humans forcefully took the land from the elves, or in this case, the city. And that's one point where this kind of happens. However, there's sort of issues here. There's two issues here that come with all of that. One is that because city and trolls are, well, different, fundamentally other from all the humans, we see something that I think, once again, is part of American consciousness, right? The humans have all these different cultures. You have your Scottish or Gaelic, Celtic, whatever group in the Hernisterie. You have your Norse guys with the Rimmersman. You have your Roman-inspired people from Naban. You have your WASPs, your white Anglo-Saxon Protestants with the Erkenlanders and so forth. We have all of these different cultures. Whereas all the different other species, their cultures are uniform. So that awareness of sort of the colonizing group as diverse versus all the native groups as uniform, I think, is once again part of the way American culture has seen itself, oftentimes subconsciously, not necessarily, consciously. I'm not calling anyone a racist here for now. But it's sort of built in there. And there's something else interesting happening here. And that brings me back again to, gender roles for a moment. Because the Canok, the trolls, right? There, the women are technically more aggressive. Their rulers are the huntress and the herder, not the other way around, which is an interesting take. Also, Siski, Binabik's girlfriend, or partner, lover, whatever you want to call her, leads the army. The women are at least equal to men, possibly even, more martial than men there. The gender roles are different there. With the city, it's the same. Women are, fight alongside men. But with humans, that is not the case. And there's a problem here. And once again, I don't think this is explicit or deliberate on anyone's part here, Ted Williams' part here. I think it's sort of one way where I can see how our cultural biases end up in the fiction and the stories we tell and the fictions and the worlds we create. With humans, that's not the same thing. When Miriamel wants to learn how to fight and use a sword, Simon is shocked. For Miriamel, the idea of losing her virginity is connected to all kinds of cultural taboos and whatnot. Whereas from what we can tell with the city, for example, promiscuity seems to be not that much of an issue. We don't ever see them do anything because this is still, very much a fantasy book that has almost no sexuality in it. But from, Aditu's behavior, it's very clear that they don't think about these kind of things the same way. And the problem with all of that, and we have the same thing with Megwin, right? Megwin wants to fight, but she's not allowed, and all of that does drive her into, madness, which she can only, end by dying, which is possibly a better ending than Éowyn's ending in Lord of the Rings, but it's still tragic because she ends her life by sacrificing herself, recognizing her mistakes of wanting to be, a warrior and leader. She recognizes all these mistakes and she sacrifices her love and her life force to save Simon so he can save the world. And that's not the best way to end this, but it kind of shows that human society is very much reflective of our world, whereas, gender equality and other aspects that you might even think more progressive are, confined to the non-human other. And that does, in a way, also other these ideas like gender equality and so forth. Once again, I don't think this is deliberate. It's just the way world building works when we don't think consciously about what we create. And I wanted to point this one out. The other part is, of course, the colonizer thing. And this is where the shifting from the scouring of the Hayhold to be for the ending, I think, makes a large difference. Because this book has a happy ending. Yes, some people die, and it's tragic. But it ends with the city returning home into their forest and slowly fading away. They kind of are nice to Simon, who is obviously the leader of the good humans, not the evil genociding humans, who still, kind of did in fact push the city from the place anyway. So we have this sort of like idea of forgiveness. Yes, there's an acknowledgement that humans went and took over and conquered a land and did push its natives to the margins of the world, but, the revenge those marginalized groups in the form of the Storm King tried to take almost destroyed the world, and everyone has to come together to actually, prevent that revenge from coming to fruition. And then they all just return to the status quo. And I think ending it there, instead of like saving the world and returning to a place that is actually will never be the same again, is significant. And for that, we need to go back to a little bit of history, because I think it will help understand matters. See, when Tolkien wrote his books, there's certainly a level of his personal experience during mostly World War I. The idea of going to fight and coming back and having one's home fundamentally changed. The same kind of goes for World War II in a way, but, at that point, the books were mostly written. So that experience is definitely in there, whether it's explicit or implicit. However, when these books were written, Memory, Sorrow, Thorn, they were written in the late 80s and early 90s, the end of the Cold War, which arguably America won, or at least America thought it had won. People wrote books like The End of History and The Last Man. And, by that time, America hadn't fundamentally changed. So, the overall ending makes a lot more sense. Yes, nuclear annihilation has been prevented. The swords have not actually, in fact, they are destroyed now, but they haven't actually led to overkill, right? And now it's time to just move on and keep going as you were before that part happened. That part being, of course, the reign of Elias and all of that stuff, the brother war between Elias and Joshua, all of these things happening. And that means a sort of amnesty, well, not amnesty, but, ignoring everything that kind of happens before. And I think that's why here the destruction, the coming home, seeing everything, being different when Simon goes back, is before the actual happy end. It's a different impetus. Another part is, of course, that, in the 1940s and 50s, England had already, lost its empire yes, it takes a while and it's arguably still not fully dismantled. But the sense of having lost an empire and being a different country was already there. And that kind of reflects in, the way Middle-earth Lord of the Rings ends. However, the American Empire was still going pretty strong in the early 90s. This is basically, the beginning of, Gulf Wars and stuff like that. And once again, this is not an explicitly political book, but these attitudes are pervasive. Yes, America had survived, say, Vietnam at the time, but it's also, like a bit of a decade ago, and maybe it's time to leave all these dark things in the past and ignore them. Or not touch, say, yeah, well, we're kind of sorry for what happened, but maybe it's time to actually have a fresh new start, forget about all the crimes of the past, all the suffering of the past. And that is where it kind of becomes a bit more dark, at least from that special reading, because it means that, the natives, in this case, both the city and the trolls, and obviously the pseudo-dwarfs, and there's a whole argument there about the navigator's children that we probably will go back into once we talk about the future books. They're just pushed to the side, and they can try to be part of this new empire or this new realm that we have now, which is very much a English, or in this case, well, pseudo-English, Erkenlandish dominated place, right? We could just have them in there, but we don't need to address all the crimes that were committed before, because actually all of that will, just open old wounds. And the problem with that is, of course, that it's a position that you can only afford if you're the victor in any form of conflict. And I think that's, once again, I'm not saying that Tad Williams wrote like an analogy here or anything of the sorts. He didn't. But it's certain societal attitudes that come through in a book, and the way the book ends, the way everything is kind of tied up. Even Rachel the Dragon gets her happy ending. Everything is fine. Yes, we mourn the lost. We do maybe even venerate them as martyrs to the cause. We do all of that. But we don't actually try to address any of the problems that led to the conflicts we ended up in. And I think that's sort of what maybe left a bit of a bitter taste in my mouth, because, as I said, it's indicative of a specific societal attitude there. There are, of course, some other bits and pieces, that I found troubling or not troubling. There's obviously an argument to be made about Gothwolf and Padraig and the way these books deal with addiction, drinking to forget. On the other hand, Gothwolf is potentially addicted to the swords. That, I don't know, doesn't work as well as it might be. There is obviously an argument to be made that the seduction of the ring in Lord of the Rings can be read as a metaphor for addiction as well. And, you have your Gollum, Smeagol, who takes a thing and becomes its slave and all of that. By Gothwolf wanting just one sword, it kind of just takes some of these trappings that we know as, readers and people living in the world. We kind of know these trappings, but it doesn't actually explore or examine them. We just have that character wander around for a while, and yes, he saves Simon, and there's intricate reasons within the plot why we have that character, but the entire plot line doesn't actually have to be there. Now, obviously, I'm not here to criticize Tad Williams for how slowly he writes these last scenes. This is not the kind of channel where we talk about which sentences are unnecessary. This book is long. It has a slow pace. It's part of its charm for me. But it does sometimes focus on surface depictions instead of examining why these things are there. And that's something that, once again, to bring this slowly full circle, happens here, which is, for example, another part when we talk about Camaris. Camaris is, as it turns out, we didn't need to know this, is actually Prince Joshua's father. Do we need to know this? No, we don't. He is obviously the greatest knight of his time, best friend of King John, and then also lover of the Queen. Now, does that ring a certain bell with you? If you think Lancelot now, you're there. Now, obviously, Lancelot having something with Guinevere is obviously something we don't go into detail here. I've talked about it before in other situations. I think it is important, however, that Tad Williams goes and makes it very clear that Camaris, Lancelot, does actually have a son. And he's obviously very pious and suffers from his infidelities and so forth, which once again is very Lancelot behavior depending on which Lancelot you're reading. But we don't need Joshua to be that son. There's no need for all of that. But the book is very good at just taking these bits and pieces from our world and just dropping them in, which is, for example, why that other king, Aelstan Fiskerne, is called the Fisher King. Now, if you've heard about the Fisher King, that's because it's another part of the Arthurian legends, in that case, of Parzival, for example, who rules this wasteland. And yes, Tad Williams takes a step back to actually call the place around the Hayhold a wasteland when they come back. He does all of these things without actually bringing the sort of spiritual and mythological meanings that these different characters, a Prester John or Presbyter John from, that medieval legend, a Fisher King, he doesn't take the meanings, he just drops in those references, and we can add something or just assume that he means something and there's meaning behind it because we've heard the names before. It's a bit of a surface level depiction of a lot of things, which once again works in a lot of ways and makes it highly enjoyable. But sometimes I wish there had been more. And it obviously also leads to these very simple solutions to finally bring it back again. The one guy actually in recent history being mean to the city was Prester John, King John, who we find out was a bad guy, because he also pretended that he had actually slain the dragon. It's like, why do we need to know this? Does it actually change anything? No, but it's more comfortable if we assume that the guy who does actually oppress the natives and the marginalized groups and marginalize them further, it's also a bit of a liar, right? And these are these sort of like shorthands and cliches and stereotypes that unfortunately crop up in this book from time to time. And they may be an artifact of trying to combine these very different fantasy genres or traditions of the more pulpy, more fallible characters that we see with a Conan or a Fafhrd and Grey Mouser or whatever, to take all of these and shoehorn it into the framework of an epic, of a mythologically sounding epic that we see with Tolkien. And at some points, there's going to be conflicts because those two modes don't necessarily work well together. And these bits are, the ones that stick out to me where I'm like, I don't know, man. Either you would have had to do much more work and make it an even longer book, or you could have just cut out some of these seemings and make it a bit more, be more consequent in the way you do this. Be more stringent in the way you do this. Be more forward. But maybe 1988 to 1994 was not yet the time where people could actually go and write a fully worldly, this side of the universe style of epic fantasy. Maybe we had to wait, to 1994 and George R. R. Martin publishing A Game of Thrones, which, Martin has been very forward in praising Osten Ard and citing it as one of his most favorite fantasy series and biggest influences. And they can be seen here. Maybe you have to have something that sort of halfway house between epic fantasy and modern fantasy, and that's exactly what Tad Williams created with Memory, Sorrow, and Thorn. Now, obviously, the question is, how does he move on? Because in the last 30 years, we have changed a lot as societies, and that probably has left its mark on Tad Williams as a writer. And it's something we'll tackle very soon when we talk about, first the novella, and then, of course, the last king of Osten Ard, who may or may not be Simon. I don't know yet. We'll find out together. And until then, thanks for sticking with me through all these very, very long videos. Thanks for liking, subscribing, commenting, and all the things you have, of course, already done, right? You've also joined the Patreon to support me financially, and maybe you'll even join up for tonight's live stream and hang out with me when I celebrate being on BookTube for 3 years. Anyway, thanks again. I'll see you soon. Until then, cheers.